Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we're here with our longtime friend, Rhys Bowen, and she's going to be talking about the brand new book, Mrs. Endicott's Splendid Adventure, which is released in hardcover and in trade paperback. And we have a dwindling supply of signed copies of both. So I'll put a link in the comments field if you'd like to grab one of those. Also, if you have questions for Rhys, go ahead and type them in, and Barbara will summon me on screen towards the end of the hour, and I'd be happy to ask any of your questions. So, Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Now, let me say it is dwindling actually, but A, we could send Reese more books, or B, Reese will be back with us in November. And
Mhm.
in fact, she's going to launch her new Royal Spineless mystery on November 18th with Julia Spencer Fleming and Jen McKinley, part of the um, I'm going blank. Jungle Reds.
Younger Reds.
Right.
Yeah.
So don't despair. We can get you a signed copy if we sell out. But this is a lovely summer read. I've described this variously as a splendid adventure. It's also a revenge story, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And it's a war story because it starts in 1938 and takes the three women in it, well, two of them anyway, through 1945. So there are many excellent features of this book. And originally, Reese, was this going to be called Mrs. Endicott's Excellent Adventure?
It certainly was. I wanted it called that. And the marketing gurus who, everything they do is algorithms. They said you cannot because when you do any search engine, Bill and Ted come up. So I had to settle for Splendid, which actually is quite a nice word. It's a very, very English sort of word. So I like that.
Actually, I like it better. I told you that when we talked about it. I
Yeah,
think it's a better description
yeah, yeah.
than excellent. And it's what's interesting is it's splendid for the three women who are the principals in this story in very different ways. So, did you start out with just Mrs. Endicott and then add the others, or did you always see that there were three heroines in this book?
I did. I started out, I mean, all I thought, me, I don't plan my whole books very in very detail before I start. I
Right.
knew I knew that her husband, her horrible rat of a husband, was going to want a divorce and thinks that she'll go away quietly and he'll give her a cottage somewhere and she'll probably keep cats and do good works. And I wanted her to grow as a person. I wanted her to find out the person she was meant to be. And then I didn't, it's no fun if you have your hero going alone. You need people to share adventures with. As you know, when you travel alone, don't you find you're in a different city and you want to say to someone, "Oh, look at that church up there," and there's no one to say it to. So you definitely need co-conspirators. And so first of all, I think Dora was the first one. She's the horrible, crotchety old woman who she does the good works in the village. She's the head of the girl guides and she's head of the church and everybody's terrified of her. And she'd be the last, when you love your heroine, you make her suffer. And I thought, what would be the very last person she'd want with her? And of course, it turns out to be Dora, who and as I went along, I realized the whole theme of this book was that Ellie thinks she's rescuing these two other women, and in fact, they are rescuing her. That hit me when I was thinking about it the other day. She's grown into the woman she was meant to be, and they also grow into the woman they were meant to be. So it's a wonderful story of sort of female empowerment, I think, for the three of them. That because there are three of them together, cheerleaders for each other, they're each able to reach their potential.
Well, that's absolutely true. I mean, it would be very difficult for one of them to have a car breakdown outside a small
Yeah,
fishing village on the French Riviera and then settle in the way that they do. But let's go back to first place. We're in Surrey when this book starts, which is kind of a bedroom community
yeah,
of London.
yeah,
And Ellie, who must be sort of 50-ish, you never
yeah,
actually say,
yeah.
she's been married for 30 years to her husband, who's one of those totally boring Englishmen who, goes to his job and comes home and wants his tea on the table at
Yeah,
whatever it
yeah.
is, and whatever. But it turns out that he has fallen prey to a younger, woman. And he really does think that Ellie will just give up their beautiful house and her life in the village. And you said cottage, but if I remember it right, what he offers her is a flat in London by Harrods,
Yeah,
which has
yeah,
apparently been his trysting place
yes.
with his mistress. And he thinks that Ellie can live there on a tiny allowance and do the occasional shop at Harrods and dwindle away.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely shows that's what he thinks of her. He has never held her in the esteem he should have held her. You know, she makes his house run like clockwork. She takes care of everything. As she says, she entertains his boring business associates. So she's done really, she has lived his life for 30 years, done everything he's wanted, made sure his life runs smoothly, and then she's completely blindsided by this. And this ultimate insult to say, I have a nice little flat near Harrods and you won't need to entertain much, will you? I mean, the utter patronizing of this. And of course, I'm not going to say it, but if you read the last scenes of the book, you do get a great sense of satisfaction from that.
Yes, absolutely. I think the only thing she's really mourning is her garden. I mean, she obviously has really, her house and her garden.
Yeah.
She isn't unhappy at losing the husband, but she is unhappy about, she can't really see beyond her narrow life in the village and her home and her garden. But she decides, good for her, that she's just not going to lie down for this. So she hires a solicitor to fight back, which is going to really surprise. Is his name Gerald? I sort of forgotten.
The solicitor, I can't remember his.
No, 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 the
Oh,
husband.
Lionel.
Lionel, thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah,
I mean, I knew it had to be some name like that.
yeah.
And then tell us how she acquires, because Dora, as you've already described, is this kind of terrifying. There's always seems to be one in a British village, and in most of the things you read, where there's some middle-aged woman who like controls the various civic enterprises, clubs, and kind of social life, whether it's the Altar Guild for Flowers or the Girl Guides or the Women's Club or whatever it might happen to be. But who's the other one? Because she's at the opposite end of this spectrum.
Yeah. Well, the other one is just an afterthought, and it's her cleaning lady, Mavis. Mavis is there every morning, good-natured, um, happy-go-lucky, and we only find out gradually that Mavis is the subject, has a horribly abusive husband. And Ellie sort of says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm going to be leaving you. Will you have enough work?" And she suddenly realizes that this impetuous decision of hers is going to have consequences for the village, including Mavis, and perhaps she won't have enough work. But then she sees that Mavis has a really nasty burn on her arm, and impulsively, I think one thing I wanted to show in this that Ellie has been the perfect measured wife and done everything. And the moment she decides to go away, either it's her impulsive side comes out or she grows an impulsive side because she does so many things that you would think are really reckless. She says to Mavis, "Come with us." And of course, Mavis, who's never probably been even to London, maybe in her life, sort of says, "I can't go because when I come back, he'll kill me." They think to start with, they're just going on a long holiday to France, is what Ellie wants to go to France, which she'd loved as a young woman before she married Lionel. And she thinks that once she's there, she can really plan out what she wants to do with the rest of her life. And she says to Mavis, "You'll have plenty of time to think whether you want to leave him or not." Mavis says, "No, if I come back, he'll kill me." So Ellie does persuade her to come, and Mavis is really terrified for a lot of the first bit of this book that the decision she's made is going to cost her life, really. Um, but like all of them, they find their niche and they grow, which is it's like when they get to the place, which is a small fishing village in the south of France, it's as if they've come home and this place has a place for them and they're welcome there and they blossom as women there and they find the life they're meant to have there. I mean, that was the satisfying thing about writing this book for me.
Absolutely. Well, you love the south of France. You spent a lot of time
I do,
in
yeah, I
Nice in
do.
that area. And I was just there in May, and we have a little video we can show
Yeah,
you at the
yeah,
end that I took from
yeah.
balcony of our suite at the Hotel Negresco, which is a hotel I've always wanted to stay in right on the Promenade des
Yeah,
Anglais
yeah.
in
Wow.
Nice. But let's go back to Ellie. So Ellie, I mentioned the solicitor because she couldn't have done it on her own. But with the aid of the solicitor, she actually is able to achieve a really decent divorce settlement, way
Yeah,
more than Lionel ever wanted to do. But Lionel's now got some pressure because the mistress is pregnant or says she's pregnant.
yeah,
And Lionel, there's a clock ticking for Lionel.
yeah,
So that works out. But
yeah.
what I really love is here's the question, they all want to run away for a holiday, but how are they going to go?
Yeah, well, to start with, Ellie's looking into trains and things, and she suddenly thinks Lionel has a Bentley. He has a really nice, big English car. And so, impulsively, again, another impulsive decision, she says, we're going to take the Bentley. He's supposed to give me my share of the things around the house. And she has made the house very beautiful because he is really from a lower class background, has no feel for antiques, etc. She's from a fairly upper class background and has made the house really beautiful. So she says, I don't want any of the furniture, some of which came from my parents and artwork which came from my parents. Or she doesn't say anything. She leaves a note behind.
Right.
Take this as my share. And obviously, he's not going to be happy, but I think that's very satisfying for everybody concerned. And so they set off in the Bentley across the channel, drive down through France, have a really lovely first encounter with what it's like to be foreign. They come into the middle of a harvest festival in Burgundy, and there's big tables laid out with all the food and wine, and they're invited to join in. And it's just an eye-opener for all of them that life here is very different from England.
Well, it is. I mean, it also, though, we have to remember that it's not any distance to take the Bentley and drive from Surrey down to the Channel, and I assume it's a ferry, cross on the ferry,
Yeah, cross.
and
Yeah,
then there you are in France.
yeah.
I mean, this is way before the Channel and all that kind of thing, but also this is before the war, 1938. So the barriers for English people just driving into France don't yet exist, and people aren't trying to leave France yet because they don't really see what's going to happen. Um, anyway, so they drive down along the road. Now, this is the route that my husband Rob and I took when we went to Paris, and then we elected to drive to Nice. And to do that, we drove down the Rhone River, stopping in Lyon, and then moving on to Nice. And Rhys and I were saying before we started, the Rhone is the largest river by volume in France, and it just buckets along. So greatly to my surprise, and we ended up in Avignon, and you hear about the bridge at Avignon, and you think it's going to cross the Rhone, and you
Yeah,
sing the little song, "Sur du pont d'Avignon, on y danse."
yeah.
The river is so powerful that the only part of the bridge that still exists
Not
sticks
much. Yeah,
out from Avignon into the water by a
yeah,
little bit.
yeah.
But the river broke up the bridge, not once, but twice. And for a while, it was the only way because France wasn't united. It was the only way that you could cross from into France from whatever Avignon was at that. I remember it was a papal state or some such thing when
Yeah,
the bridge
yeah.
was built. So it was actually a highway and a crossing point, but the river made sure it wasn't. And I was really impressed in Lyon and then driving along, stopping in Vienna to look at the Roman amphitheater there, at the sheer volume of water that the Rhone does. And there are a lot of cruises that you can take. Most of them go from, I think it's Arles,
Hmm.
to Lyon or Lyon back to Arles because it's such a big river. It's perfect
Hmm.
for river cruising.
Well, have you noticed really, as you drove down the bank, there are very few bridges still.
Yeah,
You go for a long while before you can get to the other bank again. It's
no,
and
it's absolutely true.
and
Right.
then when you're on that road, sometimes the river's just rushing along beside you. I mean, to think that this is a huge river, but it's moving like it's like a mountain stream. And that's why when you go upriver, those barges have a terrible time getting up the river because that force of water. So it's an impressive river.
It really is. I like Lyon. I have to tell you that I preferred Lyon to Paris, and I say that because the tourist traffic in Paris was absolutely overwhelming. Wouldn't have been a problem for the ladies nearly as much in 1938, but Lyon is a business city. It was the second largest city in France, but Marseille has now exceeded that, so it's now the third largest city in France. But it's always been a business capital. The silk industry there, they actually planted mulberry trees so they could grow their own silkworms, nourish them and do all this. And I like Lyon. I mean, it reminds me of Chicago, in a sense that it's very much like Chicago, whereas I think of Marseille as more like maybe Los Angeles, and
Yeah.
Paris is more like New York, if you want to make.
Yeah, well, Marseille is very gritty. I mean, it's got a huge immigrant population now, and it always did have a sort of dangerous air to it. You know, it was a port, and all the foreign ships came in, and
And
there was like a shanty town on the edge of it before that war. So, it wasn't a desirable city in many ways. But Lyon, did you know it's got a couple of Michelin-starred restaurants? Did you go to one?
Absolutely. Of course we did. I was with Rob, whose idea of travel is to first call ahead to all the Michelin restaurants he can find. Yes, we had wonderful food in Lyon, and we stayed in a small hotel that was part of an abbey. So it was over on the east side of Lyon. There's kind of a channel for the Rhone, and it
Yeah,
was absolutely delightful. I love Lyon. I would go back. And interestingly enough, when we had dinner one night, one of the restaurants, there were two couples that were eating separately, and towards the end, I can't remember why, they started talking to each other. Both of them had relocated to Lyon from Chicago.
oh wow. Huh.
And I would say they were probably in their 60s, maybe even in their 50s, but it
Yeah.
was clear that there are a lot of Americans moving to Europe, but Lyon would be if it were I and I wanted to move to France, I would go to Lyon way before I would go to Paris,
Mhm.
or as you say, Marseille. Although Marseille is fun because if you are a fan, my husband's favorite book, many people's favorite book, is The Count of Monte Cristo,
Yeah,
and in the harbor
yeah,
at Marseille
yeah.
is the
Oh, yeah.
Chateau d'If,
Yeah, yeah, right.
right?
Yeah,
So it's an isolated island. You can still see, the
yeah,
walls and the whole thing. So very cool. Anyway, the reason I digressed into all of this is that they drive along the road on whatever road was available. And when they get down to the coast, they turn towards east, towards
yeah,
Nice and Marseille. But they
yeah,
have, they have a breakdown. The Bentley has a catastrophic breakdown on a road, and the villagers have to come and move the car because it's going to block the road. And that's how these three ladies get to Saint Denis.
yeah. They're driving. They decide that they don't want to stay any longer in Marseille. They feel it's sort of dirty and dangerous, etc. So they're heading towards the more desirable places, Hyères, Saint-Tropez, all of those. But then the Bentley, while it's about to get dark, as you know, that road when you go along it,
Yeah.
there's sort of tall cliffs and everything, and the valleys get dark very quickly. And then the Bentley starts to steam. And so they have to take the first turn off they see to a tiny place that's not even on the map. And they get to this little fishing village, and the Bentley just dies. It won't go any further. So uh, if you know the south of France at all, and I hope some of our readers will, and you've been to the lovely town of Cassis, you will see that a lot of it's I probably positioned Saint-Bonnet where Cassis is, and if you imagine Cassis before World War II, before there were any tourists, etc., it would have looked like that. So it's one of my favorite places, and so it was delightful to set that there because I know a lot about it. So every time I turned and they saw something, I could picture that, and I've got photos of it, and um, it's just for me, it's just one of the most magical little villages because you drive down this incredibly forested slope past vineyards and past olive trees, and you keep driving down. And then there at the bottom is the village, just sitting there around a little harbour. So absolutely magical.
And not, as Rhys says, not a tourist spot. It was actually a working village. It's a fishing village, you know. And so the people that they run into are supported to a great degree by the fishing industry. But more than that, there appears to be a villa, an enigmatic villa. And our ladies start out in a kind of local bed and breakfast, although I don't know if that's what you would have called it back then. But anyway,
Right.
um, and and it's okay, but it's not wonderful. And there's an English couple running it, and they're kind of grasping whatever. And so part of the story, once they get settled there, because now we're going to go all the way to 1945, is how do they settle into the village? Where do they live? What kind of relationships do they develop? Does Lionel ever appear? All kinds of great questions, none of which we're going to answer. Too bad.
Yeah.
But it's a lot. It's really lovely. And I think tracing the stories of the three of them, you're right. I mean, the book really would not have the same texture if it were just one or even two.
Yeah. Well, and we didn't mention the fourth person there, which is um, a young French girl that they pick up along the way. Um, when they've stopped for to get petrol in the dark on the way down the road, there's a young French girl who's sitting in a truck, and she mouths to Ellie, "Help me." And she says she's accepted a lift from a trucker, and he's made it quite clear that he wants payment of some sort. Now it's dark, and uh, she wants out of there. So Ellie, who's again impulsive, kind-hearted, takes her along. But the more we know about this girl, we suspect that she's not exactly being truthful in what she's telling Ellie, and the more complicated she becomes, and the more dangerous she becomes, actually. But I wanted to say one thing about the villa. I think one of the driving forces behind this book, beside wanting to tell Mrs. Endicott's story, was I was on Lake Maggiore in Italy, and we were walking along, John and I, and we saw this, what had been a gorgeous villa. It was in its own grounds on the lake shore, and now ivy had come up and taken it over, and the shutters were hanging off, and the weeds were this high. And I said to John, who could walk away from something like that? There must have been someone who inherited it. Why doesn't someone take it over? And of course, being me, I said, we could buy this. We could have it renovated. And John, being the sensible one, said, way beyond us. And anyway, we're not going to be in Italy that much. And so, but I always thought about it. I always thought, what if I was given a villa and I could renovate it to what it was? And of course, the villa that we're dealing with in this book is not nearly in as bad shape as this. It's almost frozen in time. When they go inside it, there's furniture under dust sheets. There's clothing hanging in the closets. So one of the mysterious threads going through the book is who owned this and why did they leave?
And it has an interesting tenant, or at least I can't remember. Does he actually? There's a kind of wealthy but flamboyant and
Oh, no, he has the chateau behind. You're
oh,
talking
that's it.
the,
Okay,
the Viscount.
the
So,
Viscount,
so
right,
the other big property in the village up on the hill behind their villa is like a mini chateau, and
right.
it's owned by a very spoilt, effete young man who's a Viscount. And he has nothing to do with the village. All of his provisions and everything are brought in. He has his own servants, and he lives his own very remote life there for part of the year. Then he goes back to Paris to be entertained. But surprisingly, he likes Ellie, and she and he develop a very strange friendship, which doesn't turn out that well in the end.
No. Well, since I've mentioned several times that this all begins in 1938, those of us reading it already know that this idyll is going to come to a close
Yeah.
um, with the war.
Yeah.
And in fact, September of 1939 is when the war starts. And, you had a choice whether to just leave them in 1939 or whether you were going to see them through the war. And while southern France was part of Free France under the Vichy government, and the Nazis were not directly in control, well, they were sort of, but and there were a lot of refugees, lots of artists. There were all kinds of things, that particularly along the shores of the Mediterranean, it gave you a chance because you all your historicals, you really love the Second World War. I mean, you just keep circling back to it.
Seems
So
to creep in. I can't get away from it. Yeah.
no, but so here's yet a different Second World War
Yeah.
story in which you have three English women in now rooted in this little fishing village there uh, on the Riviera in Cassis, only called Saint-Bonnet. And what's going to happen to them if the Nazis come calling? Will they be deported? Will they be interned? What'll go on?
Well, I think the big debate at the beginning, once the war started, was, do we go home now?
Yeah, right,
But do they? None of them want to go back to England. They love the sunshine. They love the other people in the village. They have a place where they feel they belong. Um, and but when they decide not to go back, and then of course when Hitler invades Paris and the Channel ports are shut to them, then comes the reality. Um, you don't have a French identity card.
right.
So the very least you could be interned. And while it's the Vichy government, so they are fellow Frenchmen who are in charge, they are also people who are going along with the Nazis, and you don't know how understanding or not understanding they will be. So they do actually come up with a solution to
Right.
keep Ellie there and well, and to keep Mavis there. Um, but and everything's fine for a few years. Maybe there's not as much food as before, but everybody shares everything until 1943, when the Germans are fed up with what the resistance is doing in the south of France and what's happening in Marseille. And they realize that Marseille is an incredibly valuable port. So they march in force, and suddenly Saint-Bonnet has occupying Germans living there, and life becomes very, very different.
Indeed.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, so it's a survival story in part. Of course, Mavis can't really go home because, in fact,
Yeah,
her husband probably would kill her if
yeah,
she went back,
yeah,
especially now.
yeah,
Um, and, Ellie doesn't want to go home. And so there we are.
yeah,
Dora will leave you to figure out what goes on with Dora. But
yeah, yeah.
anyway, it's a really satisfying book to read. It has some mystery elements to it. It has, as I said, it's a splendid adventure.
Well, I like reading satisfying books. When I think of the books I like most, they're ones where you do have this great feeling of, I'm thinking of, some I've enjoyed recently, The Midnight Library, Lessons in Chemistry, all of those books are a satisfying read to me. So I think I write what I want to read and it's not there on the shelf, so I put it on the shelf. And, um, and also,
Right.
I think you and I can appreciate this. When a woman becomes a certain age, she becomes invisible. And I've noticed this that once you got to a certain age, uh, women you're invisible. You actually don't matter. I was standing in line to get a rental car when I was on a book tour once. There was a man in front of me and a man behind me, and the man in front of me was being served, and another employee came on and said to the man behind me, "Can I help you, sir?" And I said, "Oh, is it against the law to rent a car to a woman in this state? Because I wasn't aware of that." And she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, madam. I thought you were with him."
Yeah.
Uh, I
I
thought,
know you're absolutely right. I remember years ago walking along in New York with my younger daughter, who's very pretty, and I realized all of a sudden that every eye was upon her, not me, and I might as well just been a pane of glass,
yeah,
moving up the street. I mean, part of that is still the idea that women are accessories, or and part of it is, I guess, age related. Although, I haven't experienced as much of that as one might imagine. But yeah, you're absolutely right. But in a way, it's wonderful cover.
yeah.
Um, You
Well,
know,
look,
nobody notices you.
yeah. I mean, Miss Marple is the ideal sleuth because she's invisible. She sits there with her knitting in the corner. She watches everything, she hears everything, and
Right.
nobody notices she's there. It's perfect. So, there are some advantages. Well, I have to say, when I'm on book tour and I'm alone and I'm staying at a very nice hotel, I either can have room service, which is always cold and not very appetizing, or I go down to the restaurant and one of the first things they say often is, "Are you waiting for someone, madam?"
Right.
And then they try and take you to a table that's behind the potted palm in the corner, right next to the loo. And so I learned survival skills very quickly. On the way there, I'd say, "Oh no, I prefer to sit here in the window, thank you." And I say, "Please bring me the wine list right away." And then I look at it and I choose a wine that I know they can't pronounce. I say, "I'll have the Schatzheimer Gewürztraminer, please." Um, and then I get good service. So you have to, once you assert a little bit. But so I wanted these women who would have been invisible. If she'd done what Lionel wanted and she'd moved to a cottage somewhere or the flat in London, she would have been one of those invisible women. And because of what they've done, they become an impressive force in the town of Saint-Bonnet. They belong, they matter, and they're able to live, a really full life. And I mean, I think it was very vicariously living for me to be in Saint-Bonnet for 6 months and then realizing I was going to give good things to these women and they were going to be happy. I loved that.
Well, I did too. And there's so many theaters of the Second World War. So many countries, so many whatever. And it's hard to find sort of an original story that somebody else hasn't already told. But in this book, I think you succeed
Yeah,
in that. I mean, it's not the focus of the book. This is not, quote, a war book in the sense that, so many. I mean, there's just an avalanche of World War II books,
absolutely.
and
Yeah, yeah,
increasingly, I mean, originally they were mostly about men. They were mostly about fighting and, Alistair MacLean and all of that. James R. Benn writes a wonderful series taking you through the war with Billy Benn, et cetera, et cetera. Or sorry, Billy Boyle.
yeah.
But there's been in the last 10 years just an avalanche of books about roles that women played in the war. They were booksellers, they were spies,
Yeah.
they were drivers, all kinds of things. Jackie Winsper, we've talked to Jackie many times
Yeah.
about Maisie Dobbs and others. But this is not that story. This is a story about the women who got there,
Yeah.
and then the war came, and
Mhm.
then they had to survive it. But
Yeah.
it's not, the war isn't the original focus for the story.
And also, I think it's another choice for Ellie, Ellie Endicott. She's in a place where she's very happy, and she has to decide then, am I going to take any risks to make anything better for anybody? I could just sit here very quietly. Probably no one would know where I was here. I can grow things in my garden. I've got my goats. I could be quite invisible. And she has to make that's really the ultimate decision. Having taken the big decisions like to leave, etc., the ultimate decision is, am I just going to sit by and let bad things happen? And of course she doesn't. And
No.
almost with devastating consequences.
Of course, going back to England wasn't any kind of a safe berth either. I
No,
mean, when you consider that, the bombing in southern England, London, Surrey, where she used to live the whole bit,
no,
in many ways she was safer in the south of France unless her choices to be active,
yeah,
have repercussions.
yeah,
But I don't. Anyway, I thought it was a wonderful book. I really enjoyed
yeah.
it. Patrick, I sent you a little video that we could show you just to sort of get a glimpse of uh, bay around Nice and the incredible blue of the Mediterranean, which if you lived in England, you would not really be familiar with because the water is not like that around the
No,
British Isle. No,
yeah. No, I mean that's one of the things. Cassie, the water there, you've got this wonderful blue and turquoise.
here it is,
Look
right? Look at
at
that.
you look at that color blue. I mean, how can you not love that?
Right. And also there's the palm trees. Look at how
Yeah,
because of the warmth of the currents. Now it wouldn't have been quite so paved when Ellie was there, but
yeah,
you can
yeah,
see the sweep of the bay there as you go along, how beautiful the sand is
yeah,
and how gorgeous
yeah,
the Mediterranean is. And the
yeah.
British, let's remember, were really not used to this good weather. I mean, it was
Well, that's why it's called the Promenade des Anglais, because they came for the winter always to escape the British.
right.
Remember my book about Queen Victoria?
I do.
So, I spent a lot of time in Nice researching, very hard work researching Queen Victoria in Nice. I suffered
Right.
my craft, but
I know. Well, yeah, I mean, I certainly understand. I mean, there were people like Somerset Maugham who lived, on the French Riviera. Phil Kerr in one of his World War Bernie Gunther books after the war, I think it was in 47 or 48 or something. He wrote the whole thing
Mhm.
on the Mediterranean where Mom and people, were playing bridge. And, there's some gorgeous hotels there that I mentioned the Negresco, but there's the Cap Even Rock, and
Yeah.
there's some really very um, five-star hotels that would have attracted
Oh yeah,
people, still do,
yeah.
with lots of money. So in many ways, it was kind of an icon post-war anyway, particularly, but also I think around Victoria's time up until the First World War, I
Yeah.
suspect.
Yeah. Well, because anybody who could afford to would escape the very dreary English winters. And so most people went like February, March, January, February, March to the Riviera. When, I mean, I have been there at that time. It's not that warm. In fact, when you watch something like Enchanted April and you watch them swimming in the Mediterranean, I'm watching and going, no, no,
Oh, it's
it
cold.
might look nice, but it's cold. Don't believe them. Um, but I mean, it would have been much sunnier and so many things blooming. All the mimosa and things would have been wonderful at that stage. So it's just a feast for the senses. So obviously, anybody who could would go at that time of year. Of course, the place that I'm describing is very different. It's a small working fishing town. There's no luxury hotel. There's
No.
no Michelin starred restaurant. It's very basic, but I do like writing about food always, and I think they did have some good meals. And I'd like to describe the simple but good meals that you would have had in a town like that.
And the wine. Yeah, no, absolutely. Lots of the British went to Egypt in the winter. In fact, Thomas Cook started, the whole idea of winter travel and a tour company by taking people to Egypt, if I remember right.
Yeah,
Um, you
actually,
know,
my aunt did. My aunt, my uncle's wife. She accompanied her mother and right until World War II. Every winter they went to Egypt, they went to Palestine, they went to Jordan. I've got photos of all those places
I-
that and strangely enough, after the war, when she married my uncle, who was really quite well off, she didn't want to travel anymore. So they would go to a lovely hotel in Torquay and they would sit in the glassed-in lounge and have a coffee and take a little stroll. And it was so annoying to me that they had all this money, but they didn't do anything with it.
that is interesting. Well, that's where Agatha Christie was, probably the same hotel in Torquay.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
anyway, this is a lovely book to read for August. And if you were not able, for example, to travel this summer to the French Riviera, here's your chance. So, Patrick, come and join us and tell us if we have any questions from the audience.
Okay. I do. You caught me having a little bite to eat. Sorry.
Right? You're allowed
Um,
to do that.
let's see here. Well, there is a question that just came in. What's next for Reese writing wise?
Well, that's always a complicated question, isn't it? Those of you who know me know that I do one of these big standalones each year, and then I do one of my Molly Murphy series. Now I'm writing it with my daughter Claire, and then I do one of the Royal Spinus series. So the next book to come out is in November when I'm doing the launch at the Poison Pen. And it's the next Royal Spinus book, and it's called From Cradle to Grave. And I have to say, it has probably the worst nanny from hell that you could ever want in your family. So Georgie's going to have her work cut out for her. And and then after that, next spring, next March, the next Molly book comes out. And it's interesting. As this series has gone, we're up to book 22. Um, as the series has gone along, we've focused much more, I think. We've been very aware on the role of women and the restrictions for women and the fact that half the population couldn't vote. And so the whole sense of the suffrage movement has taken on a much bigger role in the books. And this one is called Vanished in the Crowd. And it has to do with a female scientist who was researching, they've just discovered viruses. And she's been doing research on the polio virus because polio at that time still was a huge killer and maimer of children. And because she's a woman, the papers are all published in her husband's name, and she's supposed to stay home with their child when she's really the brilliant researcher. So that's part of the story. The other part of the story is it's a huge celebration, a real one, for the Hudson Fulton celebration. 300 years of Henry Hudson discovering the river, and 100 years of Fulton inventing the steam boat, thus enabling commerce up and down the river. So there's a giant celebration. The naval parades with battleships from Germany, England, Japan, and then there are parades rather like the Nice Carnival or the Rose Parade with these giant floats that do things. And there's a historical one, there's a carnival one, there are men from the military one with men marching. And the big thing about it is the whole city is electrified. Suddenly you've got these electric lights everywhere. The city is blazing at nighttime. So it's a huge spectacle. So that's the background, the setting for this book. So it's really interesting. If you're interested in real history, and and then I've just turned in, and I know the editor likes it, so I can tell you about it, next year's standalone, which takes place on the Isle of Skye in Scotland. So,
Oh,
I thought it was about time. I like Scotland. It's about time I wrote about it. And it's about a very elderly, famous, very famous woman writer who has dementia. Imagine Agatha Christie with dementia, that famous. And she can't finish her last book. And she's Australian, so she hires another young Australian writer to finish it for her. And the book is set on the Isle of Skye, which is very strange because this woman has very little connection. And so the young woman is sent up to the Isle of Skye to get a feel for the book so she can finish it. And while she's there, she becomes convinced that there's something odd about this story. And I'm not going to tell you more because it's a surprise thing, but it's another of these books, rather like the Rose Arbor I did before, where you fill in the tiny pieces of the story as you go along, and what you learn here is going to help what you know over here. So yeah, it's
Is
called.
that the is that the first time you've written about another writer as a protagonist?
I think it is. Yeah, I
yeah.
think it is. Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
And I really like Sky. What time period are we in?
We're in, well, the main part of the book takes place in 1965. And but it's a book within a book because we have the book that the writer has written but can't finish. And so we know all about that. And that was written in that was written 1932, it takes place. But then we might have the writer's own story that takes place around the turn of the century. So we've got three different time periods with different bits
Oh,
of a story going in it. So yeah, it was
Was Iris Murdoch an inspiration at all for the story?
it's interesting you say that because my character's name is Iris.
Really?
Yes, yeah. So, but I'm thinking more Agatha Christie because she's beyond famous. She's the sort of woman that if, when the book comes out, she will sell millions and millions of copies. So, and she has a detective called Inspector Melrose, and he's a Scot. So, uh,
Do you know the story of Iris Murdoch though? That she got dementia
oh, I do,
famously?
yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah.
Yes, I've seen the movie with Jim
and
Broadbent.
actually,
Terrific.
Agatha Christie did too, towards the very end of her life.
Did
If
she
you,
really?
Really?
I didn't know that. No.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah, she did. If you, Max, she was 10 years older than her husband,
Yeah, yeah.
Max. And towards the very end in her 80s, I think she was 88 or something, around in there when she died.
Hmm.
Um, she was really incapacitated. So,
Yeah, I mean, I did know about Iris Murdoch, yes, and it was incredibly sad because she was
Yeah.
very, I mean, if you read her book, she was always a little bit of a tortured woman, wasn't she?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Definitely.
wasn't like Agatha, who was just writing books to entertain and amuse everybody. She was writing sort of soul gut-wrenching books sometimes.
yeah, although I think that Agatha had more gut-wrenching stuff in there than sometimes we give her
Yeah.
credit for. And it was interesting to watch that series where David Suchet followed in
Oh, I love that.
that
Yes. Yeah.
I thought so too, but when you follow her with Archie,
Yeah.
the year before he threw her over for his golf partner,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and that's coming.
Yeah.
And you have to wonder how much she suspects that it might be coming. There's a, you know, there was a divide in her life I didn't think she ever recovered from.
She adored him, and it was, and and I had to write an article for the Washington Post on Miss Marple and Agatha Christie, and the interesting thing is she wrote her first Miss Marple story the year after that whole Harrogate thing. So she sees herself as the invisible woman suddenly.
That's really true. In fact, you and I both contributed to that
Yeah,
Bloomsbury volume on Agatha Christie.
yeah,
I wrote about all the places that I have stayed in where she had been before, like the
yeah,
Para Palace Hotel or
yeah,
you know the hotel in Egypt at the Cataract Hotel, or her own house, Greenways, and so forth. And she traveled a lot in those sort of way that people at the height of the empire
yeah.
before it started, imploding, did travel.
Well, she was pretty fearless, wasn't she? I mean, she got on a plane and went to Baghdad alone. She was,
Well, I thought showing her taking up surfing in Hawaii
yeah,
was really very cool. I mean, we tend to think of her as kind of, middle-aged and, as you say, invisible and all the rest of it, but there she was in her bathing suit leaping onto surfboards
no,
and
I was there last week and I thought about that because
yeah,
the picture of her with the surfboard, and I showed my daughter because we went and run one restaurant where there was an old surfboard hanging up. And I said, imagine the weight of that thing.
yeah.
It was like it was like 8, 9 feet long and it's wood. She would have had to carry that, or perhaps someone carried it to the beach for her, but
No, she did. I mean, there's some video or some old film of
yeah,
her doing that, and
she
yeah,
loved
she was, and she met Max. If you remember, she was out on a dig with the
it. Yeah,
Blues,
yeah,
and so she did a lot of traveling in places
yeah,
that like
yeah,
Baghdad.
yeah.
Was she very tall?
She was a big woman. I don't remember how tall she was, and unfortunately.
Maybe 5'5", 5'6", which probably was quite tall in those days, but
Yeah,
well,
and she was an eater, and so she
yeah,
really put on weight. She was when you see her in this with David Suchet, she's still young and fairly lissom,
yeah,
but in fact, in her autobiography, Come Tell Me How You Live, that she wrote about her life with Max Mello, and there's a whole scene where every year she would go to get new clothes to go off on a dig in Mesopotamia with Max, and she muses on the fact that every year her size has gone up, and she's gotten bigger
yeah.
and bigger. So, the whole British addiction to tea and carbohydrates and all the rest of it, I think, you know,
Well,
made
she
her,
she 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 creates Adriani Oliver, who is her alter ego in a lot of the books, who is always munching something, apples or
yeah,
something else, but also is quite a large woman.
yes, very, very large, very imposing. So she became less daring and less mobile as time went on. But
But
now,
she Agatha was never an imposing woman. She was always very shy. And
Yeah.
I love that when she goes to the premiere of her play, The Mousetrap, she gets to the door and they say, "Where's your ticket?" And she doesn't have one and they turn her away. And she's walking away when someone recognizes her and said, "For God's sake, come in," you know. But she was going to go away again because she didn't have a ticket. So that shows you she was not, she didn't act like Queen of the Universe.
No, in fact, she was chairman of the detection club after Dorothy Sayers died, but she only did it on agreement that she would just be the figurehead, and I can't remember who it was designed to actually run the meetings of the detection club because she
Yeah,
didn't want to take the spotlight,
yeah,
you
When
know.
did she pass away? In the 70s?
I think so.
yeah, I think so, yeah.
78 or something like that.
Yeah.
I can't remember. Max Mallowan actually wrote a very interesting memoir of his own about his life with her,
Mm.
which I read in order to write the article that Rhys and I, or chapter that Rhys and I both contributed to this academic book about Agatha Christie that Sophie Hannah was the editor for. And it was really interesting to see her from his perspective. Um, I enjoyed that a lot. And he had tremendous respect for her.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, he was the ideal husband for her because after, Archie was the gorgeous, flamboyant one, probably always selfish, always, going
Oh,
off
yeah.
playing golf and things. And Max was very caring and clearly adored her, which was very nice.
If she had stayed with Archie, she never would have written all the books. You
I,
know, I mean, the fact that Archie cleaved her life in half is what really enabled her to have this amazing career as a writer. It
yeah.
would never have happened if she'd stayed married to Archie. But anyway, we digress because we're not actually here
No, any
talking about Reese, not about Agatha Christie.
any more
Anybody else?
questions, Patrick?
Excuse me?
Any more questions?
Yeah, there are actually a few, and ones I haven't really heard you talk about too much.
Okay.
There's curiosity about all the books that you wrote before you took on the Rhys Bowen pseudonym.
Hmm.
Um, can you talk about your career
Um,
before this
yeah.
1997, which is when we first
Yeah,
got to know you?
yes. It was well, it was checkered, let's just say. But I've been a published or a working writer all my life. Right after college, I went into the BBC in London, and I was in the drama department on the production side, and we'd be working on a play, and I'd think, oh, if I'd written this play, I certainly wouldn't have ended it that way. So I went home and wrote a play, and with the bravado of a 22-year-old, I walked down the hall to the head of drama and I said, "I've written this play." And about a week later, he called me in and said, "Yeah, we really like this. We're going to do it." And so I have been published, performed since then. So I did a couple more plays for them. And then I was lured down to Australia by ABC, Australian Broadcasting. And uh, and then I met my husband, and he was on his way to British guy, frightfully aristocratic British man. I go to Australia thinking I'm going to date all these rugged sheep farmers, and instead I end up with this man who wears an ascot and has to have a side plate at a picnic. Um, so, so we wound up in California where there was nothing like the BBC. So I started writing children's books, and I think one has, when you look back over your career, there have been real strokes of luck along the way. My first picture book was illustrated by somebody very famous. And so when it came out, it got a whole page review in the New York Times. Now, how was that for a first book? And it was named New York Times Best Book of the Year for picture book. So it got off to a really good start. So I did several more picture books, and then I got an agent, and she said to me one day, she called and said, "Could you write me a teenage novel in a hurry?" And I said, "I don't know. I haven't thought about it." So I went home and I went to the bookstore and saw what there were. And there were very few. This was 1980. There were probably Hinton, Peck, Judy Blume, and that was about it. So I brought them home, spread them in front of me. And my husband walked behind me, looked over my shoulder and said, "You don't write that sort of stuff." So you know me, a little voice went, "Ha." So I did, they wanted 3 chapters by Tuesday. So I did do the 3 chapters. I was given the go ahead to do the rest of the book. And I found out after I'd finished the book that it was going to be one of the books that Bantam was going to use to launch a series called Sweet Dreams, which was the first really, really popular teenage series. It was interesting because the whole market moved. Until then, adults had chosen books for young people. The school librarian, the aunt had given you the book. Suddenly, you're bringing out paperbacks for teenagers, primarily girls, I would say. I think they cost $3.99 each, so they could afford to buy one a week. And it was really a phenomenal time to be there because these things went through a printing of 100,000 in a week.
Wow.
Um, so, for a while it was so heady that my agent would say, after you've done those two books for Bantam, I told Fawcett you do one for them. And then it was like, um, which was lovely. Well, it turned out to be very useful because my husband had just been laid off from his airline job of 20 years, and we had three kids in college. So I found I was writing crazily. I finished one book, writing another, and then I think we put the kids through college and we paid off the house, and I suddenly thought I don't have to do this anymore. I got the books that were fun. They were often, I suppose.
Were they written to order? Or
Um,
were they,
no,
did they give you certain topics that they
no,
wanted you to
no.
know?
I mean, I had complete freedom. I
Wow.
told them what I wanted to do, and they'd say okay. But they always had some romance in them, and they were just really slice of teenage life. And where most of these series were quite, serious, heart-wrenching. In fact, the one that did the best was called Ten Boy Summer, sold 500,000 copies, and it was a whole spoof on romance. And I don't know if the teenagers got that it was a spoof on romance, but it starts off with the two figures standing on the hillside after the prom, and the traditional watching the sunrise. And it has the girl's auburn hair streaming out in the wind. And then she turns to her partner and says, I can't help feeling that something is lacking. And the other person says, well, maybe it would have been better if the boys had stayed awake. And they look back at the car where the two people in tuxedos are snoring with their mouth open. So, that's how the whole book was. It was a complete romance spoof, or this is how romance is in real life sort of thing. But it did very well. So I did a lot of those books. And then finally, I thought I'd said everything I wanted to say about going to the prom and not going to the prom and having a best friend and losing a best friend, etc., etc. Um, so suddenly, I think what did everything was finding Tony Hillerman. I discovered Tony Hillerman in the library, and I thought I've always been a fan of mysteries, but this was more. This was a mystery that took you somewhere, that made you feel you were somewhere, that opened your eyes to a completely different environment, different people. And I thought, that's what I want to write. So I had to think, where do I want to set a mystery series? I live in Marin County, California, which needs no more sleuths. I grew up in quite genteel England, and but then I was telling a friend about my childhood experiences with my mother's family in Wales and all these quirky people there, and I suddenly thought, yes, I do have this place to write about. So my first series was with Constable Evans. So I'm still very fond of him, and I get letters all the time still saying, "Is there going to be another Constable Evans book?" But so I think the problem with Constable Evans was while I was writing it, the whole mentality of the police force was changing. We were moving to a central place with computers as opposed to having policemen out in the communities. So, it became really almost too difficult to go on. So anyway, that's a shortened version of how I came to be where I am today.
That's great. I've never heard any of that stuff.
Yeah,
Um, Maybe
And
some of your explorers
Reese
haven't
was
either.
also extremely lucky in that the first of her big books,
yeah,
and her publisher at that point didn't want it, and it allowed Reese then to take it to a different publisher, and that
yeah.
was another big career turn.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, uh, I, people have said to me, "Oh, you've worked so hard, you deserve this." And I said, "Look how many other writers have worked hard all their lives, and then suddenly their series are dropped." I think I've taken the
Yeah.
risks each time, and this was a risk because,
Yeah.
as you know, owning an independent bookstore, um, this is Lake Union, and they are one of the Amazon publishing houses, and they are the enemy. And I appreciate that, and I appreciate that a lot of bookstores don't want to stock Amazon books, and that's, that was the risk I had to take. But they sell very nicely elsewhere, so I'm really quite happy. And the interesting thing is that they sell all over the world. I've got my books sitting there in Lithuanian and Moldovan and even places I've no idea where they are. But it's kind of fun to think of people going, oh, and here comes Hara Rhys Bowen.
Do you have the rights back now for the Evans series?
No, I don't, because they're all in ebooks still. They're all available, and they're
I
and
see.
audio, or ebooks and audio still all out there. So um,
Yeah, it'd be nice to see some new paperback reprints.
it would, yeah. They
Maybe.
actually did the whole series in England with Joffrey books. They reprinted the whole series. So um that was nice. And of course we've had so many television nibbles on that. Uh,
Right.
and they don't come, it's hard to get the funding. There was a Welsh TV company that was very keen on doing it a couple of years ago, and nothing has happened of that. So, we'll see. It may,
Well, there's sort of an insatiable demand for crime shows on both Acorn and BritBox,
well, yeah,
and
yeah,
quite a few of them are Welsh, and
yeah,
so
yeah,
it may
yeah.
eventually come along. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, I do have the option, very nice option on the Royal Spinus series, so I'm hoping that comes to pass, and
Yeah,
it all looks encouraging at the moment, but you never
wonderful.
know. Yeah.
Well, it'd be
Maybe
really
a
fun to
couple real
see.
quick questions because
Yes.
everybody's been sending them in. Um, One of them was about, you've built this amazing career, but sticking mainly to historicals. Does writing something in the present day hold any appeal to you whatsoever?
Well, the thing, especially for mysteries, the thing I like about historicals is you're not relying on CSI. You're not any sleuth in the past. You take Molly Murphy. She has to use her observation. She has to use her intuition. She has to really put herself out there. She can't just say, what can you analyze the blood spatters for me because it didn't exist. So
Yeah.
you've got a much more interesting, and also all of the motives that we have in the past. The whole thing about I love another, but I'm not free. I am the true heir to the fortune. None of those exist anymore. So, and facts that I'm writing about a woman who can't vote, who is the property of her husband, whose husband is legally allowed to beat her with a stick no thicker than his thumb. I'm writing. I'm putting myself into a time, and also I love to use so much real history so that people actually are learning. I think Barbara and I have talked about how much we like to learn real things when we're reading a book. It's very satisfying that you become an accidental expert when you write these books.
Okay, so maybe the final question is somebody on YouTube is begging you to write another uh, a Christmas book.
Yeah.
Any chance of that happening?
I do love the Christmas books. I'd have to think when it would be because the next Georgie book has to be the coronation. It's the coronation of King George and Queen Elizabeth in 1937. We cannot ignore that because obviously Georgie would be invited. Um, so we have to have something happening at the coronation, I think, maybe after that. But we've had lots of Molly books or 3 or 4 Molly books that have been Christmas, and there is something about writing with that lovely atmosphere and having the chestnuts popping. Of course, one of my favorites ever was the 12 Clues of Christmas. I think that's one of my favorite books in that series, in the Royal Spinus series, with absolutely every aspect of the traditional British Christmas that I could think of. That was really nice to. So yeah, maybe I'll do another long short story like I did the one called for Amazon called What Child Is This, which is a Christmas story. Um, so yeah,
Okay,
Wonderful.
great.
Wow, those are really interesting questions. It was nice to have that whole
yeah.
sort of catch up because I don't think we've talked about that all
Mhm.
that much. Um, Thank you very much. Let me remind everybody that we do have, as Patrick said, a dwindling supply of autograph copies, but an unending supply of not autograph
Yeah.
copies. And we can always get more autograph copies if the signature really matters to you. And we'll see Rhys in person on November 18th when she joins us with Jen McKinley and Julia Spencer Fleming, which is part of her Jungle Red cohort.
Yeah.
So that'll be really fun. We're lucky that she spends part of her year in Arizona, so we get to actually see her in person. But given the heat in August, we thought that, yeah, I know, it's just brutal. Right. That possibly a virtual event would be kinder all the way around. So many thanks for joining us. Have
Thank
a
you.
great evening, everybody. Rhys, enjoy the rest of your book tour.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you soon. Patrick, thank you too. And
Of course.
yeah, stay cool, both of you.
Yeah,
I'll
meaning
try.
stay indoors.